And to make a long story short, they observed twice as much hypertrophy at both sites when they were doing lengthened partials compared to a full range of motion.
Scott, thumbnail, 2x the growth, question mark? No, 2x the growth, exclamation mark.
I mean, based on this study, that's true.
Shit writes itself.
You know?
Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for RP Strength, and I am joined by esteemed colleague Dr. Milo Wolf, sports scientist extraordinaire, born in Belgium?
That's correct, in my own house. No hospital needed, you feel me?
You're kidding me.
No.
Wow, you birthed yourself.
And I was birthed in a place that has the word Genesis in it.
Unbelievable.
No joke.
And I assume the birth was done with a lengthened partial range of motion?
Yes.
Of course. And that brings us to our topic for today. So Milo is a super expert researcher, and I would say, without any reservation, the world's ranking authority on range of motion, by a long shot. He has been involved in multiple studies independently on this topic himself, and has done the most comprehensive literature review on range of motion. But since he has done that, more research has come out. So this is your early to mid 2024 update on the state of what range of motion optimizes hypertrophy. And Milo, take it away.
Let's do it. So first, let me get you up to speed on where things were in about 2023, 2022. I put out a systematic review of all studies on range of motion for muscle building and strength, but let's focus on muscle building.
Strength.
Who cares?
Yeah. If you get jacked enough, you get strong.
It's true. Anyhow, what we found at the time was that a full range of motion was very, very marginally better than a partial range of motion for muscle building. When you just looked at full range of motion versus partial range of motion, you just dumped it into two baskets. However, that's probably not the right way to look at it. It turns out we have other studies comparing, for example, isometric holds at different muscle lengths. So you can do an isometric hold when you're training your biceps at the top, for example, and you have a real nasty peak squeeze, and your biceps are at short muscle lengths. Or you could do it at the bottom, and your biceps are at long muscle lengths, and you're just holding the weight, essentially. When you look at those studies, of which there are 5, you consistently saw that longer muscle length holds are better than shorter muscle length holds. Likewise, the same seemed to apply to partial reps. Let's say all you're doing is 50 degrees of elbow flexion range of motion. You could do the bottom half at longer muscle lengths, or you could do the top half at shorter muscle lengths. The only real difference there, it's the same exercise, it's the same actual range of motion being gone through. The only difference is the muscle length of the muscles being targeted. And once again, across those now 10 studies, I believe, you consistently see, I think in 9 studies of those, that longer muscle length partials will lead to more hypertrophy than shorter muscle length partials.
And in science, when 9 out of 10 studies are saying something, the probability that that something reflects the real reality in the world is high.
Correct. And funnily enough, in the 10th study, if you actually just look at the numbers, and that's a study by Stasinaki and colleagues on the triceps, the differences, broadly speaking, except for one measurement, do still lean in favor of long muscle length training.
Damn.
They're just not large enough to be considered significant or what have you. And so those are studies on partials and isometrics. But when we just dump things into two baskets, full range of motion, partial range of motion, we see that full range of motion is better than partial range of motion by a very small margin. That doesn't really tell us about everything, because it turns out the muscle length at which you train seems to be a pretty important determinant of how much muscle you build. And so we went one step further and divided the partial range of motion into 2 different baskets. Was the partial range of motion being performed at shorter muscle lengths on average than the full range of motion? If you're doing a curl, for example, the average muscle length of your biceps might be around the midway point, let's say 90 degrees of elbow flexion. You could do a partial on the top half at a shorter muscle length, or in the bottom half at a longer muscle length. And so we divided partial ranges of motion into whether they were being done at longer muscle lengths on average than a full range of motion, so that bottom half, or shorter muscle lengths, aka the top half. And it turns out that when we looked at things that way, 2 things were found. One, most of the studies out there at the time had compared shortened partials to a full range of motion.
Almost certainly. And I would say it would say with a lot of external ecological validity or applicability, because let's be honest, before you showed up, most bros in the gym, their idea of partials was the top end partials because it was ego fuckery that they were looking for. So that's an important finding, that full range of motion beats partials when partials are in the squeezed top half. But What about partial range of motion in the bottom stretch position versus full ROM?
And by the way, full range of motion beating shortened partials, it makes a ton of sense when you consider the research I just quoted. Longer muscle length training across isometrics and partials with the same range of motion do seem to beat out shorter muscle length isometrics or partials. And so full range of motion being performed at longer muscle lengths obviously will also beat shorter muscle length partials. And that makes sense because there's evidence of a principle here.
Yes.
But then we also had 3 studies at the time, there's been more since then, and that's what this video is about, that compared longer muscle length partials, so the bottom half of a curl, for example, to a full range of motion. And just as you'd expect, based on this overall principle that we seem to find across around 25 studies now, it seems like lengthened partials might be better for hypertrophy. At the time, we had 3 studies, and let me go one by one. The one study that found no difference in hypertrophy was a study by Workhausen and colleagues in 2021. They looked at the leg press, comparing a super tiny range of motion of 9 degrees of leg pressing in a concentric only exercise.
Kyriakos Grizzly co-author?
Probably, shit. So 9 degrees of range of motion is next to nothing, right? And in a concentric only exercise, so the degree to which this applies to your training, if you're doing eccentrics, questionable.
Yeah, so don't get in the hack squat and just bounce around.
Correct.
Got it.
Correct. They compared that to 90 degrees of range of motion on a leg press. So a much larger range of motion, more in the shortened position. And they saw similar hypertrophy of the quads. Though neither group really saw much hypertrophy because their training was kind of not that good anyways.
So just as a scientific note, when your core variable fails to show a large,
change,
meaningful effect, the entire ability to conclude differences between the variable is a bad deal.
Compromise.
It's like measuring which car is faster, like a Corvette or a Mustang, but neither car got off the starting line. I wouldn't really get into the differences.
Correct.
Bad news.
Correct.
So please continue.
But there were 2 more studies at the time. One was a study by Pedrosa and colleagues, where they had participants train in one of 4 conditions. In one group, they just did full range of motion leg extensions. In the second group, they did the bottom half of that leg extension. In the third group, they did the top half of that leg extension. And in the fourth group, they did half of their training as bottom half partials, so lengthened partials, and half of their training as top end partials, or shortened partials. And what they saw essentially was that the group doing only lengthened partials saw the most favorable hypertrophy at pretty much every site measured. It was consistent across a couple muscle groups at a variety of points across the muscle in terms of regional hypertrophy. And it was just a pretty solid study in favor of longer muscle length training. For example, the shortened partials group generally saw the worst hypertrophy, as you'd expect based on the 10 studies I mentioned earlier.
What kind of magnitude of difference are we talking about?
In this study, if I recall correctly, we're talking about roughly 50% more growth.
50.
In that sort of...
50.
Correct.
It's a big deal.
That is from what I recall. I could be off here, so some leeway. So that was the second study. The third study was a study by Godo and colleagues. Now, this study compared roughly mid-length to long-length partials. On average, the muscle length was a little bit longer in the partial range of motion group compared to the full range of motion group. But it could be argued to be closer to a mid-length partial. In this study, they compared full range of motion skull crushers to partial skull crushers more so in the bottom position.
I remember that study.
Correct. And to put it simply, they observed more hypertrophy in the partial group. I don't see this study as super strong evidence in favor of lengthened partials because it was closer to a mid-length partial. It was still on the lengthened side of things, but you could argue it's more like a constant tension rep. But regardless, as far as actual science goes, when you just categorize things into full range of motion, a more shortened partial or a more lengthened partial, it did fall on the side of being a lengthened partial. So you might say, look, and this is actually what I concluded in the study, and people nowadays are misquoting it to no end. You could say, look, these are 3 studies. I don't think there's a ton here. And to be honest, you'd be partially right, maybe even mostly right.
Partially, you say?
Nice. However, you can also take an alternate stance, and that's to say, look, we have like 10 studies comparing partials at different muscle lengths, seeing more hypertrophy with longer muscle length training, 9 of which found that. We have isometric studies where they found more hypertrophy from lengthened training.
They're different angles to the same truth.
Correct. And it is ultimately just lending credence to the principle that lengthened training, on principle, seems more hypertrophic than shortened training. But equally, you could say, look, 3 studies, I'm not really with this. At least as far as saying I'm going to do lengthened partials as a standalone technique over full range of motion all the time, always. However, there have been 2 more studies since then directly comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion. And there have also been some other studies in other areas looking at the general concept. let me talk about the other studies first. The couple studies I'm talking about are studies looking at the seated versus standing calf raise, for example. These two studies by Kinoshita and colleagues and our own lab in Lehman College with Brad Schoenfeld compared the seated and standing calf raise on hypertrophy of the soleus muscle, so one of the plantar flexors, and the gastroc. Now, the soleus, all it does is plantar flex the ankle, aka get you on your tippy toes. However, the gastroc is also a knee flexor, which means that when your knees are extended, as they would be during a leg press calf raise or a standing calf raise, they are more stretched than they would be during a seated calf raise.
By a long shot.
Correct. And so we're just comparing the seated calf raise to a standing calf raise. The standing calf raise is a more lengthened or stretched exercise for the gastroc. And what did they see in these two studies? Well, they observed largely similar hypertrophy of the soleus, whether you're doing a standing calf raise or a seated calf raise, which makes sense because ultimately the muscle length is the same. All the soleus does is plantar flex the ankle.
Yep.
Your knee can be in any position it wants to be, but the soleus is going to be growing essentially. However, in both of these studies, gastroc growth was quite a bit superior in the standing calf raise versus the seated calf raise. So, a couple conclusions. One, longer muscle length training did also seem to be better for the gastroc and adding more evidence to the principle that lengthened training appears to be better for hypertrophy. And two, you probably shouldn't be doing too many seated calf raises.
Or any, I would say.
Yeah.
Now, criticism of that could be, technically speaking, the gastroc is an insufficiency and thus barely gets activated when it's at a bent position versus straight.
Sure.
But it sure doesn't go against the lengthened partial stuff.
I agree.
It at very least has nothing to say about it, but at most has lots to agree with it. So what other studies do we have then?
The one final thing I'll note on active insufficiency is that in these studies, we're not talking about fully flexing your knee and getting your gastroc as shortened as possible. We're talking about a 90-degree angle. So there may be some insufficiency, but the degree to which may or may not actually contribute to hypertrophy.
Sure.
Because with any argument of, well, this muscle has better leverage in this position or what have you, there's also the counter argument of it has worse leverage, but it still is responsible for that joint function. So if you take a set close to failure, it will contribute as much as it can and produce tension and so forth. So that is the calf data. However, we have two more studies that have been published and one secret study that I've been involved in that I've got the results of, but it's not been published yet. But I'll still talk about it in the end. The first study is a study by Cassiano and colleagues in the calves, yet again.
Italians?
People love the calves. Brazilians, I believe.
Oh,
Brazilians.
Cassiano.
Indeed.
Got it. Continue.
They compared a full range of motion on the leg press calf raise to just doing the bottom half of the rep, lengthened partials, to doing the top half of the rep. And they measured gastroc hypertrophy, because that's the muscle being impacted by, in this case, along the soleus, by the range of motion being gone through at both a lateral and a medial side, so essentially the outside and the inside of the calf respectively. And to make a long story short, they observed twice as much hypertrophy at both sites, when they were doing lengthened partials compared to a full range of motion.
Scott, thumbnail, 2x the growth, question mark? No, 2x the growth, exclamation mark.
I mean, based on this study, that's true.
Shit writes itself.
You know? The final study actually found a similar difference in hypertrophy as well, around twice as much hypertrophy in all muscles measured. And that's a study that hasn't been published yet by a group of researchers that's been actively involved in this data. It's done a study on the seated versus lying leg curl. It's done a study on the push down versus overhead extension. And that's a study by Mayo and colleagues. They compared on the multi-hip machine using a within participant design, if I recall correctly, doing a full range of motion to doing just the bottom half of the rep. So essentially, a multi-hip machine you can think of kind of similarly to an RDL or hip hinge type movement. They were doing a hip hinge type movement, either doing the bottom half of the rep when the hamstrings and glutes are most lengthened, to doing the full rep, or essentially just getting their hip to neutral, not hyperextending the glutes. So one criticism is they didn't really use a full range of motion because they didn't hyperextend the glute, if there's a benefit to be had there. I'm skeptical, but it's certainly something you could argue. Regardless, they measured hypertrophy of the hamstrings and the glutes. And to make a long story short, across all 4 heads of the hamstrings they measured, if I recall correctly, and the gluteus maximus.
Did you say 4 heads?
4.
Aren't there 3 heads of the hamstring?
It depends. You can say semitendinosus, semimembranosus, biceps femoris long head, and biceps femoris short head.
Oh, we got them biceps femoris shits.
Yeah, you feel me?
Damn, there's some science.
And by the way, some recent science also thinks the quadriceps aren't 4 heads, maybe 5. So
Yeah, there's all kinds of
Pentaceps.
wacky shit. Some
just-
people have like an extra muscle here and there too
Yeah,
from evolution
it's
and
wacky.
shit. Damn. All right, sorry, please
But the
continue.
only extra muscle I care about is growing more muscle than I already have.
You want to see extra muscle? Boom,
Feel me?
motherfucker.
Growing muscle, other areas too. Only in the right conditions though.
All conditions.
See you later.
Mostly in the inappropriate conditions.
Full range of motion on that though.
I'm conditionally released by my parole officer. Anyway,
Regardless, in this study, once again, they actually observed around twice as much hypertrophy in all heads of the hamstrings, around twice, a bit less in some muscle groups, a bit more in others, in the hamstrings and the gluteus maximus. So that makes 5 studies, comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion. Across 4 of these, they saw substantially more hypertrophy. I think 2 to 3 of these saw like twice as much hypertrophy from lengthened partials to full range of motion, and some of them saw lower magnitudes. That's still not that many studies. It's 5 studies. So if you want to take a very, very conservative approach and only consider the most direct studies,
bordering on cynical, but yes.
you could say that full range of motion is still the default approach. Now, I could say back, look, you're just using that because it's the tradition. Like,
Correct.
That's what
Appeal
you've
to
been doing for a
tradition.
while.
It's a fallacy.
Correct. But fortunately, that's not all the evidence we have. We have evidence of a broader principle at play. As I've mentioned, in total, there's like 25 studies now. And there's one final study I want to mention before we head into the sort of wrap up and practical applications. And that's a study we conducted up in Scandinavia with Stian Larsen taking the lead. So shout out Stian Larsen. And essentially, we trained around 30 participants with a within participant design, meaning one arm was being trained one way and the other another way. One leg was being trained with one range of motion and the other with a different approach. So that, again, washes out differences in genetics, sleep, stress, et cetera, which is
Do
good.
you think that the cross-education effect muddles those results at all?
For
or-
strength, yes.
Okay, but
For hypertrophy, there's no reason to expect it,
no
to my knowledge.
obvious mechanism.
Correct, yes. And the interesting thing about this study is they didn't just train one muscle group. They actually answered 3 different research questions in 3 different muscle groups.
Extra credit ass motherfuckers.
Hey, man, that's because I was involved in the study design. And so I was like, look, these are some questions we need to answer. We don't know everything yet. So let's make sure we design this in a good way that
Yes.
maximizes the use of the study.
Yeah, studies aren't free. They don't happen often, but let's try to make them good. Yeah.
Correct. Let's start with the calves, because we've talked about the calves quite a bit here, and it's a very easy thing to describe. With one leg, they were doing full range of motion calf raises, ending the set when they couldn't get another full rep. With the other leg, they did full range of motion calf raises, but then when they couldn't get another full rep, they kept the set going, doing just partials, until they couldn't get even another lengthened partial. And to make a long story short, at the sites measured in the gastroc, they observed around 50% more hypertrophy, 50, in the group going a bit past failure, doing some lengthened training. Which to us answers the question of, in a shortened biased movement that's hardest in a peak contraction position, does going past failure and doing some lengthened partials until you can't get another partial increase hypertrophy? And based on this, it seems like yes.
Not even yes, but like yes.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
50% is a big deal.
Correct.
10% would be like worth thinking about.
Correct. So the next muscle group studied was the biceps. And for the biceps, they were essentially looking at the impact of muscle length on hypertrophy. Both arms did cable curls. For both arms, the resistance curve on the cable curl was set up such that the cable was orthogonal to the line of pull at the bottom of the rep, maximizing the force production requirement in the stretch position. So if you think, for example, about the difference between a cable dumbbell kickback, where there's no tension at the bottom, versus like a dumbbell fly, there's essentially no tension at the bottom in the stretch position in the kickback, and there's a ton in the dumbbell fly.
Yes.
In this cable curl variation, they were trying to mimic what you get in a dumbbell fly, with lots of tension in the stretch.
Got it.
However, the difference between the 2 arms being trained was that one arm was right besides their body with the shoulder neutral. So essentially the biceps relatively lengthened, but not maximally lengthened.
Right. So examining high tension at a lengthened position,
Correct.
but not high tension at a maximum stretch.
Correct.
Okay.
They weren't training in the most lengthened
And
position
so what was the
possible.
other arm looking like then?
The other arm was individualized, so each participant just went as far back as possible to get as much shoulder extension or hyperextension as possible to maximize the stretch on an individual level on their biceps. So some people went further back because they could. Some people, if they couldn't, went a little bit less further back. And we actually measured the range of motion of hyperextension as well, just so we could have some data on, look, this is how much more stretch there was. And on average, they put their arms back about 45 degrees compared to their torso.
When they did the stretch position one, did the cable get placed higher so it was also
Correct.
orthogonal?
Yes. It was always set up to be orthogonal.
Always.
Correct.
Okay, that's
so that was
important.
matched
Okay,
between
got it.
conditions. And in this case, they actually didn't really observe any major differences in bicep growth at a more proximal site or a more distal site. At one site, there was a bit more growth in the more stretched arm. The other side, a tiny bit more growth in the shortened. It wasn't really consistent, and it wasn't a big difference to speak of. It certainly wouldn't be significant based on the preliminary results I'm describing here. The final comparison was what I found most interesting and most relevant to a lot of people in terms of how they train their quads. They compared doing a leg extension with their hip flexed to 90 degrees, as you would often find in a regular gym, right? Like 90 degrees between your thighs and your torso.
Just like this.
Correct. To having your hips flexed to only 40 degrees, so quite a bit more extended.
Okay.
Closer to what you do in a sissy squat, or what you could do with a good leg extension machine where you're kind of leaning back. If you've seen Tom Platz do leg extensions, for example, he would often extend his hips.
Yes.
Not necessarily for this reason, but he would do it.
For Tom Platz reasons.
Correct. Just training as hard as possible.
I have a prime leg extension machine in my gym, which is excellent, and it allows you not only to load the lengthened position more, but the seat slides back so far that you can get like 30 or 20 degrees.
There you go. They compared 90 degrees of hip flexion to 40 degrees of hip flexion. There was actually a previous study that had assessed activation of the quads using T2 MRI, better than EMG in likelihood, showing that, activation of the rectus femoris, for example, was greater when it came to the more extended hip position.
Makes sense.
Which makes sense because the rectus femoris is a hip flexor, so when you extend your hips on the leg extension, you're lengthening it more.
Yes, and it takes it out of insufficiency more.
Correct, if there is some insufficiency going on. Regardless, for the other heads of the quadriceps, hip positioning doesn't impact their length.
It can't
They're
because
not
they
hip
don't
flexors.
insert on the hip.
Correct.
Right.
And so they measured hypertrophy of the vastus lateralis, which doesn't insert the hip, so positioning doesn't matter for it as far as length goes, and the rectus femoris, where it is being lengthened more when your hips are extended 40 degrees. What did they find? Well, they measured both a proximal site, closer to the hip, and a more distal site, closer to the knee. For the vastus lateralis, as you'd expect, there weren't really any differences between groups, because the length isn't being impacted. There's not really any major difference between a more extended hip position and a less extended hip position. For the rectus femoris, however, they measured hypertrophy at the proximal and distal site. At the proximal site, they observed 170% more growth in the group with the extended hips, training in a more lengthened position.
Huge deal.
And at the more distal. At the more distal site, they observed 50% more growth as well. So, as far as exercise selection and overall training goes, this kind of suggests to me a few things. One, based on the calf results, doing some partials after failure in the lengthened position on a shortened biased exercise is likely going to create more growth on a set per set basis.
Did they compare that to just bottom end partials in that study?
No.
Ah, fuck.
Yeah. You only have 2 legs, and otherwise you need to get even more participants in.
Well, a few of us have 3 legs.
You feel
Not
me?
me. Scott, the video guy.
I mean, it barely counts as a third leg. It's like a thumb.
For me?
Yeah.
Oh, thumb is a... Thank you.
Charitable.
That's quite nice.
So I do.
I think Scott actually operates the camera with a third leg, to be completely honest.
I'm guessing he needs like a 170 millimeters focal length to zoom all the way in.
All that, well, everything you said, but with dicks, yes.
So that's one answer. The second answer is, if you already have a lengthened biased movement where your biceps, or any muscle potentially, are relatively lengthened, and it's already super hard at the bottom, like you can think of a pullover on the ground or something, where the tension's pretty high at the bottom, but you're not maximizing the stretch on your lats, right? Because the dumbbell's hitting the ground.
Yes, but you're still Gucci.
Correct. You may still be good, because the hypertrophy of the bicep is similar. So maybe, if the resistance curve is sufficiently difficult in that somewhat stretched position, you're good. And finally, when it comes to the leg extension and the rectus femoris, one, longer muscle length training, probably better for hypertrophy, first of all, quite clearly even as far as the results go. And two, when it comes to your exercise selection for the quads, picking exercises that create more of a stretch is probably good, which means, as we'll reveal in another video, the leg extension may not be that great of a choice if you don't have the right machine for it.
Yeah, because you can't lean back.
Correct. And most of the time, the resistance curve is also very short and biased, which, based on some other results, like for example, if I study comparing the preacher curl to the incline curl, finding more favorable results in the preacher curl because there's more tension in that somewhat lengthened position. Based on those results, for example, even if you can get a decent stretch via the machine, if the machine is super easy at the bottom and there's basically nothing going on, that may still not be good enough. You need both muscle length, but primarily maybe tension at that position.
So it's probably more important to have tension at the lengthened position than it is to have a stretch,
Correct.
especially if the stretch doesn't have a lot of tension in it.
Correct.
So if you're stretching in a way in an exercise that isn't at high tension, dope, cool. Probably the stretch grows a little bit of muscle, but you need to stay there for 60 hours a week to get that.
Yep.
But if you can create a situation where there's not a ton of stretch, but at the longer muscle lengths, you're getting a lot of tension imposed,
Yep.
then good things are happening.
Correct.
Which makes a lot of sense.
And as an add-on to that, that is evidence against the idea, and this makes sense, that just the stretch is creating the hypertrophy.
Right.
Because if just the stretch was creating the hypertrophy, it wouldn't matter how much tension was down there.
Right.
Right? And if you look at the stretch data, stretching in humans does cause some growth. But usually you need to stretch for quite a long duration.
Yes.
And not spend an extra 10 seconds during your session doing some bottom half bullshit. And in fact, I have a whole article on that topic that's coming out by the time of this video. It'll be out on Strong by Science on the topic of are lengthened partials just causing more stretch-mediated hypertrophy? Answer, probably not. And this study kind of provides more evidence to that. But broadly speaking, I want to give one caveat, and then we can move on to the practical takeaways. Most studies on lengthened training, do not look at the most lengthened position possible. So while it's definitely a good idea to train at relatively long muscle lengths, and I think you're probably going to maximize growth training at very long or maximum muscle lengths, at least at times, it's worth noting that we have evidence of the lengthened position being more hypertrophic on a pretty wide level. When you compare deeper squats to more shallow squats, when you compare bottom half calf raises, where like you're talking in a straight leg position about maximum muscle length for the gastroc, to full range of motion, even that causes more growth. But most of the evidence we have is on relatively shortened training versus relatively lengthened training. And consistently more lengthened training causes more growth. Whether or not that also applies at the very extremes of extreme stretching, we have less data on. But personally, based on just how consistent the evidence is across 25 studies, I do think you probably want to maximize muscle length when training.
I love it. What are your practical takeaways? Because I have some of my own.
Sure. If you want to maximize hypertrophy, the stretch is not something you want to miss out on. If someone came to me nowadays and was like, look, I want to maximize hypertrophy, I would almost certainly put lengthened partials in their program. I would almost certainly bias their exercise selection to include plenty of lengthened exercises. And we have a whole video on that either out already or coming out soon on the RP channel. I would generally probably recommend emphasizing the lengthened position via tempo as well, controlling the eccentric or lowering phase as you reach into that deep stretch, pausing in that deep stretch position.
Don't make it a short time down there.
Correct. You want to spend more time there. Correct. And you can skimp on the more shortened position.
The way I do my tricep extensions with a cable, and I get shit for this on the internet, why not, is I do control. So I do quick here on the eccentric, slow, pause, dip, slow, pause, dip. And that makes sense.
For sure.
And the other way of like really getting down here would be the opposite of what we want.
That is correct, yes. And the final thing is just be explosive out of the start of that lifting phase, because that's ultimately, at the start of the lifting phase is when your muscle is most lengthened. And so if you can be explosive there, accelerate the weight, produce as much force as possible, that is likely a good thing.
You don't have to pulse it out, but really get out of it.
Correct.
Sure.
Because ultimately, if an exercise isn't set up to have a lot of tension there especially, if you just half-ass it, you can definitely half-ass it and get out of there.
Yeah.
But you're not producing as much tension in a position as possible.
Yeah.
And based on some of the research I mentioned, we do want to be producing plenty of tension in that position, which, again, goes against the whole stretch-mediated hypertrophy hypothesis.
Damn. Stretch-mediated hypertrophy, punching the air, RN.
Yeah, fam.
LOL. So my takeaways are really simple and they're twofold. One, if you do full range of motion training for the lulls, then do not miss the bottom end, get that deep stretch with lots of tension down there. And number two, highly consider either modifying some or many of your exercises to be just the bottom half lengthened partial, or at the very least, consider some of your sets, maybe the last little bit of a set, or even every set, ending it with lengthened partials, because now we're getting from the hypothetical literature into, damn, this seems like there really is some legit shit. And the effect magnitudes seem quite impressive. So definitely, point 3 is don't do top end
bullshit
here because you might not grow a ton. Agreed?
Fully agree.
Awesome. Folks, Milo has his own YouTube channel. It's amazing. I would go check it out. We've probably linked a bunch of stuff. And we will no doubt be seeing him again, hopefully on this channel. And also, if you drink rum, Captain Morgan is great because there he is.
I get royalties.
He does get a lot of money. Folks, see you next time.
Peace.